My name is Bryce. My name is Bryce, and I'm with the Rights and Resources Initiative, and I lead RI's work around private sector engagement and local economic development. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned over the last 8, 9, 10 years on engaging with companies and leveraging those relationships and networks to, further stronger connections with communities and to advance tenure reforms on the ground. I mentioned that I coordinate a network, a nested network within RI called the Interlocking Group. It's an informal platform, an informal network and platform where leaders from leading companies, investors, the development finance community, civil society, and then indigenous and community organizations come together to collectively find ways to leverage private sector support for community land rights. That means a lot of things. I'll talk about what it means. You see some of the groups and brands and leaders from brands and local organizations and civil society who are represented in the group. This is a handful. The group works at the global level, facilitating a dialogue which we've had over the last decade to identify gaps in ways to leverage private sector support for land rights. We've created guidance, document case studies of emerging practice where communities and companies are working together. What are some of the alternative production models? These things, demonstrating emerging practice and putting it in the hands of companies as well as communities. We're also leveraging some of the supply chain and portfolio connections of the groups present in the Interlocking Group to open up spaces at the national level, at the level of production, at the level of where we may see conflict between companies and communities, to establish dialogue in that sense, and start to support what I want to try to say here. To open up spaces at the national level to leverage private sector support to advance reform. So I'm going to talk more about that. That's the Interlocking Group. So what's the logic though behind it, and what are some of the takeaways for I think this group and this audience to think about when considering how to engage with companies and to use those connections to push for sort of collective solutions, on land rights issues. There's really, from our perspective, we really focus on the strategy boils down to two main ingredients. Change on the part of the companies is a function of two ingredients: creating a sense of risk for them to change practice and providing a place for them to go, a credible pathway. So you see this simple formula at the top. Change is a function of these two ingredients. And both of these ingredients, these strategies are required. You can imagine that there maybe there's a really effective campaign, there's a lot of pressure to change, but if there are no options to change practice, if there's nowhere to go, you won't get change. At the same time, maybe there are a whole lot of ways to do business better, to change practice, but if there's no pressure to change, you don't get change. So both of these strategies are required to sort of change practice. And this logic underpins a lot of almost all of our work with the private sector. So a few examples here: activities that increase a sense of risk for companies, advocacy and campaigns. The hooks that that are most effective to engage with the private sector are around cost. What does how to link in this discussion the land rights issue to their bottom line? So there's a good deal of research out there on this, specifically the link at the bottom of this box. I'm sure this PowerPoint will be shared as an example. They're also really concerned with reputation and brand. Those are two of the main hooks for engaging with companies. A couple of emerging strategies to increase that sense of risk are associated with supply chain mapping, which I'll talk about in the next slide, and then grassroots monitoring of environmental and social impacts associated with supply chains and investments. Those are some example activities to increase the sense of risk. On the other hand, how do you provide a place to go? How do you create options? for folks, for your target audience, companies to change practice. Multi-stakeholder dialogues, establishing a balanced space for exchange between companies, civil society, and communities to identify those places to work together. That's what the interlocking group does. Showing the way, consensus-based tools and guidance, having a position, particularly from the community side. What is the ask? If you want to change, if you're asking the companies to change practice, what do you want them to do? Enshrining that in guidance and consensus-based tools. Capacity building, both from the company side, training, teaching this audience how you want them to act in the future, the practice the communities want to see. At the same time, capacity building on the community side to be able to engage in a more balanced manner in the appropriate spaces with the private sector. And finally, the same as on the other side, grassroots-based monitoring of environmental and social impacts is an additional area that can support collective action and working together. So an example here is the two examples here, the Communities as Counterparties report showing sort of the risk approach and advocacy approach to engage companies. And the example on the credible pathway side, a collective position paper, the interlocking group facilitated in Laos to influence some regulations on the forest policy. A joint position may be developed by companies, civil society, and organizations representing communities to have a collective position on what belongs in those regulations. So an example of communities and companies working together collaboratively. The key item to remember here is that the private sector has substantial political capital. So when you think about the three main groups, companies and investors, government and communities, in many cases, the private sector has a lot more political capital in communities. If there are ways to leverage companies to advance the reform agenda with governments, in many cases, that can be a really effective pathway. I mentioned supply chain mapping. This is an important and emerging strategy to engage the private sector, both on the risk side as on the pathway side. You can now map from the level of production all the way up to all the groups who are buying a particular raw material to the investor side, and then ownership in a particular company. So what you see here, the yellow box is PT Enacta, is a concession holder in Indonesia producing palm oil. We commissioned a mapping analysis of this and a bunch of other concession holders in a particular region to identify points of leverage, what groups at different points in the supply chain and investment community are committed to in terms of responsible action, to identify ways to use those commitments to pressure them to improve practice on the ground. So you see, you can link this group to almost all of the big brands who are committed to the RSPO principle, they're RSPO certified, different normative standards on corporate practice, and the same thing for the investment community. So by identifying these, like this chain, and entry points, like what groups have committed to doing or committed to in terms of sustainability, those represent entry points to bring pressure, particularly from the upstream or downstream onto groups at the ground level to change practice. So I'll talk about that in the next slide on a case. This is
just a quick time check. Just a quick time check that we've got about 15 minutes left, just to make sure we leave time for Q&A
okay.
as well.
I'll finish this in about a minute and then open for questions. This is a case from Indonesia, where we're leveraging community-based monitoring and interlocking group network to support communities, to local indigenous community to engage with local palm oil companies and to push for recognition of their customary rights. In state of play, this community of customary landowners, the majority of their territory has been cleared by palm oil and forest concessions. They don't have formal land rights. The number of conflict, intimidation, all of those, local challenges community faces with respect to the companies, contentious relationships. They've been unable to advance their land claims since the early 1990s, but in the last year, key concession agreements have come up for renewal, 40-year terms. So it's sort of a strategic moment to try to leverage a strategic moment to try to leverage community rights to formalize their rights and use the private sector to do so. The concessions there are linked to many of the big brands, some of which I mentioned in the preceding slide. Over the course of the last 3 years, we supported the community and used investment chain analysis of the palm oil concession, identifying those entry points at different points in the supply chain, documented local impacts using community-based monitoring, fed those into the appropriate platforms. In 2020, the community submitted a formal complaint to the RSPO, which was accepted. In 2021, the RSPO visited and the company visited the community for the first time in 25 years, and indicated, okay, they're open to continuing this dialogue. The community formulated a number of asks, what they want, and they're supported by lawyers on the capacity building side. So looking ahead, how's this case going to shape up? We don't know, but these are some ideas. We'll use these networks to invite buyers, some of the brands, to bring pressure on the local company for the RSPO to respond, as well as the producer company to change practice. We'll push for a joint pilot of the community-based monitoring between the company and the community, so the results and understanding what's happening locally are the same and they can respond. Pushing for a multi-stakeholder dialogue between community, company, buyers, the RSPO and the district government to identify collectively what they'll do together, with the goal of engaging local government to formally recognize the community's claim to the law. And there are a few links and resources here that are available online. So that's my presentation. I hope it was clear. I was trying to be quick. Thank you.
Great. So thank you. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. I think there's a lot of different angles here to dig. There's a raise hand button on the bottom, and either just jump in or raise your hand. I mean, while waiting, I would have a question, Bryson, if
Sure.
I may, which is, this is one example, and I'd like to get very specific for my own understanding about the ask.
Mm-hmm.
That I understand the motivation. So on the one hand, there's fear, on the other, there's different avenues available. But in this case, you've got a specific ask. But in other cases, I mean, are there certain categories of ask that seem to work well, and others where we don't make such progress? What is the ask of these companies?
To the private sector?
Yeah.
It depends. I think one of the big asks, the big entry points now of forest positive sustainability policies. These are the strategies companies are coming forward with to achieve 2030 climate and conservation goals that are now built into their operating plans. Essentially, eliminate deforestation and support livelihoods in the areas where they're sourcing. So they were not successful in the last decade reducing deforestation, right? And one of the key hurdles there was they didn't do enough on customary and informal land claims in the places where they're sourcing. So compliance with their with those policies is one key entry point, particularly at the global level. So that's important to make those global to local supply chain connections. That's a way to bring pressure. Another important hook are emerging legislation in the EU, existing legislation in some of the European countries requiring human rights due diligence and prohibiting deforestation associated with products imported into European markets, which are also looking at for the US and potentially US and UK. Groups don't know how to comply with that. They don't know, they still are not able to understand very locally what's associated, those impacts associated with the production of these products. There's a tenure angle there. So that also is another important emerging hook.
Super. Thank you. Samira?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bryson. It's very, very interesting. I've got a question. In what way do you see that the Tanay facility partners could tap into this opportunity, and how could they work together with you or with others? Where should they start, and what's needed for that?
Well, I should have concluded my presentation with this. If you're interested in what I've presented here, or if you or your constituents are, if there's an overlap, should I say, with production areas of, if there's an overlap with what, if there's an overlap with, sort of private sector activity where maybe a tenure facility project is proceeding, I'd be pleased to, and we would be pleased to explore that. What we see is that from the supply chain side and the investment side, ultimately a lot of the activity on the ground rolls up to the same supply chains and the same players at the global level. So by strategically applying pressure amongst some of the global actors, I think there's a lot of latitude to start to influence practice on the ground, which we're moving forward with in several countries. So I'd be pleased to be in touch if there's a company around and you want to know more about them, I'd be pleased to be in touch to advise. And additionally, some of the resources here, including like this map of like this type of work. A group called Inclusive Development International does some of this work. They do it really well on mapping. So that's often a good starting place if you want to know more.
Graham, oh my goodness, Graham and then Kundan.
Hey folks, morning. Interesting presentation. My question is, so the company or the private sector body there, they receive the community monitoring reports, or the analysis of that report is now fed to that private sector organization? I'm trying to understand how the system works, basically. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, that's one of the important, I think that's one of the most critical areas to flesh out in the next year or two. That system doesn't exist currently. I think we could all agree that, companies in government are at the table, but communities are generally very frequently are not in the context of investment. There's a ton of capacity to do community monitoring, but there are very few platforms in which to feed that information to leverage it. And that's one of the missing ingredients. So one of the initiatives under the interlocking group is to create, to develop the rules of the game and create those systems internal to companies. What are the vehicles through which companies can source and engage with communities around local data, and then be in a position to respond to it? That's what you're suggesting is what's being developed with this in this case that I was describing. And that's one of the big emerging gaps for the space, and also one of the big strategic opportunities, to practically change practice. What it means is, what doesn't exist, if companies want to know what the local impacts of whether or not their supply chains are sustainable or not, they don't currently have the vehicles to ask the people who have to live with them, right? So that's the gap that we're trying to bridge and needs to be bridged. I hope that made sense.
Super, thank you. Kundan? Kundan.
Thanks, Bryson.
Oh, there you are.
Yes. Great presentation. Thank you, Bryson. And a couple of questions on observations that I wanted to make, that as you pointed out, the whole process of the interaction between the business people, local communities, the right holders with companies take place in a larger ecosystem. And there's a local ecosystem and a local ecosystems around this. There are, you have addressed some certain parts of this, which is, I also wanted to get your at the local level or at the ground level, where the interaction between business people, local communities and companies often take form of human rights violations or resource takeover or conflicts. The issue of what are the other options along with that you for example, legal action, and whether that is something which you have been trying to look at. And then on the upstream side, at the investor level, so the companies, both the companies who are working on the ground, but also the companies are higher up in the supply chain. The investors, the financial institutions which are investing in these companies, and there's quite a bit of movement for responsible investing. And that is something which how we can engage with them and ensure that they put pressure on the corporate sector. So basically identifying additional pressure points along with the ones that you mentioned, which are really important in order to kind of transform the system.
Okay, well, thanks, Kundan. I appreciate the reflections and your the co-conspirators and all this to begin with. So I think, well, maybe just quickly on your first one on other uses for this information, I think legal action certainly is one, and that's part of I've only talked about a slice of the strategy here, but the sort of larger engagement strategy is using those legal avenues and leveraging, it's interesting, leveraging the community source data to support the sort of legal approach. So that certainly is part of it and should be part of it, right? Because this, sort of one of the early slides I showed on felt risk and credible opportunities, right? There are multiple ways to continue to raise the pressure, and you've got to bring multiple strategies on both sides. So, and your question on the investment community is, I think, the same gap facing the same gap I was referring to on the previous question, the vehicles from the company side to understand their local impacts, like that those platforms don't exist. It's the same for the institutional investor community. If you look at where these groups source data on, and for an institutional investor who owns a ton of equities or debt of a bunch of different companies, the places where they source the information on their holdings on sustainability data, like MSCI, there's some other ones. There's no community data there. There's no communities aren't part of that data set. So, right, that additionally is another key area where communities require a seat at the table. If these groups are serious about sustainability, if they're serious about mitigating impacts locally, if they're serious about leveraging supply chains for good in rural parts of the world, then communities deserve a seat at the table, both from the company side as well as in these places where the investment community is sourcing information and making decisions on it.
Bryson, we have a minute and a half left. Only a minute and a half. And I want to hear something optimistic before we end. Tell me a success story.
I think this case is it's not a success story yet, but a lot of this work hasn't happened before that I'm aware of. In different forms and fashion, of course, there have been campaigns and getting companies to the table, but leveraging and legitimizing and leveraging community source data on the local impacts from the community perspective to push for change on the part of companies and investors, and using that towards securing land rights, that's not happened before, to my knowledge. And I think that's the innovation. And I think it's an innovation that is equally valid across all the regions.
Great. Kundan, you've got about less than a minute. Kundan.
Yeah, just a suggestion is that, wonderful work that Bryson and are doing on this, that it would be really useful from indigenous people and local communities perspective. We can map out the key actors who are kind of form the various parts of the ecosystem. So that, for example, on the ground, if a community is facing a company doing certain things, what are the various options in front of? Which are the organizations, for example, in US or networks in US or UK or other places they can reach out to? So if that would be a really useful thing, sort of. I don't know if it's already been done, and if it's not done, maybe we should think about mapping out these key actors and making it available to larger audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunta. Now we have, there's just a couple of seconds left. I don't know, Bryson, we're going to have another group in a minute. What's your big takeaway from this discussion to take to the next group?
I hope I can do the presentation a bit quicker and more clearly. And I appreciated all the questions, and I certainly appreciate your attention. If you want to be in touch with me, I know they'll share the
We'll share these slides. Yes.
Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to be in touch.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining. And we're back.
Hey, Dan.
Okay, so still a few people
Hi, Bryson.
around, but basically we have the
Hey,
same,
Nanette.
same numbers last time. So I would, and we were a bit rushed last time. So I would suggest, Bryson, you jump right in. So Bryson Ogden is based in Washington with the Rights and Resources Initiative, and we're talking about leveraging the private sector to make change. So Bryson, carry on.
Yes, I'm trying. I've got too many screens up. Just a sec. Let me make sure I've got the okay. All right, here we go. Bear with me. Okay, share screen. Okay. Okay, everybody. Thanks for joining this group. I'm pleased to be here with you all and have the chance to talk about a little bit about some of the lessons from some lessons on engaging with companies to advance land tenure reforms. Like Dan said, my name is Bryson. I'm with the Rights and Resources Initiative, and I lead RRI's work on private sector engagement and local economic development. And I coordinate a platform within RRI called the Interlocking Group. The Interlocking Group is a network, informal network of leaders from the corporate sector, the institutional investor sector, development finance, civil society, and indigenous peoples and communities groups. These are leaders from these different stakeholder groups. You can see some of the logos of the groups and leaders who are involved. The purpose of the Interlocking Group is to scale up where these leaders come together to identify ways to and work together to scale up private sector support for community land rights. We work at the global level, identifying gaps in gaps facing the progressive corporate investor community to support land rights, implement their commitments, but also leverage these networks to open up spaces in countries to bring together producer organizations, local civil society, and governments to identify ways and share challenges, and then advance the tenure reforms. So I'll talk a little bit about the logic behind what brought this group together and how we think about engaging with the private sector. The logic boils down to a simple equation that change is a function of bringing a sense of felt risk, and at the same time providing credible opportunities or options to change. Both of these ingredients are required to instigate change on the part of whoever you're targeting. In this case, the companies or investors. You can think about felt risk. Perhaps is a really effective campaign. All the pressure is building on a company to do better, to change practice. But if there are no options to change, you don't get change. At the same time, perhaps there are a whole bunch of different ways to do something better, to produce, to engage with communities. Maybe those options all exist, but if there's no pressure to change, you won't get change. So both of those ingredients are required. Okay, below some examples of activities that increase the sense of risk, advocacy, and campaigning. For the private sector, the most important hooks are on messaging and data are around what are the impacts on costs and their bottom line. Also in reputation and impacts on brand. Those are two of the most sensitive points of sensitivity for private sector. And two emerging strategies to bring that pressure are associated with supply chain mapping. Mapping, all the groups, linked to that, production of a particular commodity and to the investment sector. I'll show that in a minute. as well as grassroots monitoring of social and environmental impacts of companies. On the other side, activities to support those credible pathways, development of options to do better, multi-stakeholder dialogues, something the interlocking group does, bring groups together to identify, okay, what do we need to do better and doing it together. Consensus-based tools and guidance, particularly from the community side, enshrining the ask of communities on what they want in terms of practice, and pushing that onto the private sector, having those positions and enshrining them in tools and guidance, critical strategy. Capacity building, both training for the private sector companies, investors, and their staff, but also capacity building for communities to build capacity to engage in a more balanced manner with companies and investors. And then similar to the other side, grassroots monitoring of local social and environmental impacts. It's key to remember here, and a key strategic element of all this is that when you look at the three main parties, we're talking about communities and indigenous peoples, the private sector and governments, policymakers. The private sector is often one of communities are often the most disempowered of the sort of three legs of the stool. Private sector wields substantial political power, and if there are ways to leverage that political power to influence governments, that's a key strategy to advance the reform agenda, the 10-year reform agenda. So that's some logic on engaging with the private sector. This is a supply chain map. And I wanted to share this with you all because this is a really important and I think emerging strategy that you're now really able to quickly and easily do, that helps fertilize any engagement with the companies. What you have here in this yellow box, I don't know if you can see my cursor, this PT and ECDA is a concession holder in Sumatra, in the middle of nowhere. But you can map from the concession level all the way up to who owns PT and ECDA, all the way up to Samsung, all of the groups that it supplies palm oil to, and then all of the groups who have invested in PT and ECDA through the different bodies. And what this does is it reveals different entry points for advocacy or engagement. You can see who's committed to the RSPO certification. You can see who's committed to the UN Principles on Responsible Investment or the VGGTs, all the different normative standards. And this then reveals different entry points to engage and leverage and bring pressure. You can do this for this group, Inclusive Development International. I've plugged at the bottom a link. This is a really effective strategy, a really effective tool to advance engagement with the corporate sector, bring pressure. So I'd like to talk just quickly about, Dan, how am I doing on time?
You are about where you were last time.
Okay.
Which is to say we've got about 17 minutes left. Okay.
This is my last slide. I'll talk about a case where some of these different elements are coming together. Where we, RI, and others are supporting a community to engage with companies, local companies, and leverage the private sector to push for recognition of their customary rights in Indonesia. Okay, so just quickly, the state of play, this indigenous community, the customary landholders in Sumatra, the majority of their territory has been not unfamiliar in Indonesia, cleared for palm oil and forest concessions. Customary, I mean, they live in the middle of oil palm plantations. They've been unable to advance their customary claims since the early 1990s for a number of reasons. Some key concession agreements in their customary territory, which has all been mapped, the 40-year term are up for renewal in the last year or two, which means there's a sort of strategic moment to bring their claims back and try to secure their land rights. These concessions in the community are linked to many of the brands and groups that I shared in the previous slide, all of whom have committed to respecting human rights, respecting land rights, and leveraging their supply chains to reduce deforestation and contribute to local livelihoods. So key entry points and points of pressure. In 2019, we commissioned an investment chain analysis of the palm oil concessions in their area, supported by the community documenting violations in environmental and social terms in their territory by the community-based monitoring. We leveraged that information, who's committed to what's happening locally, and brought a formal complaint to the RSPO against a particular company, which was accepted. There was a bunch of community capacity building in the background to help them get to the table. In 2021, the RSPO visited, along with leaders from the company that was being targeted, visited the community for the first time in 25 years, indicating there's appetite to engage in the dialogue and find a solution.
Just want to make sure that everyone knows what RSPO is.
Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil.
Thank you.
It's a certification body for the palm oil industry. And the community, of course, has come up with their ask of the company. What do they want? Restoration of degraded areas, part of the income, a bunch of specific asks. So sort of everyone's at the table based on leveraging different strategies to get them there. The next steps, this is all in progress. What are we going to do next? Okay, we'll invite some of the buyers using the interlocking group linked to this company to come to the table to pressure the RSPO and the producer company to bring additional pressure to change. We'll aim to jointly pilot a community-based monitoring framework where communities providing data, the companies responding to it in a way that's appropriate to advance the engagement and change practice. We'll push for a multi-stakeholder dialogue locally to bring the community, the company, buyers, RSPO, and district government to come together to assess the situation and identify collective ways to move forward, with the goal of specifically engaging the local government to formally recognize the community's claims, right? And the innovation is going to be leveraging the companies to push for that. That's the ambition. So there are a couple of resources on the side that you can click through, I'm sure, when the presentation is shared. So that's my presentation. Some logic on engaging with the companies, some strategies, and then a case to try to demonstrate how the pieces fit.
Great, thank you.
Happy to open for questions.
Thank you, Bryce. Questions. There's a little button on the bottom. You can raise your hand. Maybe while we're waiting, I have one of my own, which is, I was intrigued by that supply chain slide because there's so many actors between the big brands and the communities. And it's quite, I'm sure different supply chains will have different levels of complexity. But there's all these intermediate steps, and I'm wondering, those intermediate players in the supply chain must be closer to communities and potentially to governments. And do these same approaches, have you applied them to intermediate players in the supply chain, or just the big brands?
Well, it's a question of leverage. I mentioned at the beginning, one of the big leverage points is brand, and associated with brand is visibility is reputation risk. Mm-hmm. Nestle's brand, frankly speaking, is a lot more valuable. Should I say valuable? They're a lot more concerned with their brand than is S&G Biofuel, a regional player. More people know about Nestle than know about S&G Biofuel.
Yeah,
if you get my drift, right? So the pressure that can and should be applied, and their sensitivity to it is different. That's one of the challenges with engaging and trying to influence some of the regional and national players. It's that reputation risk.
Okay, and so we're saying that those intermediate players who are known locally, yes, they're not Nestle, but they probably do have a brand or a reputation locally, that they are less amenable to, your two leverage points were, one was fear and the other was alternative avenues. And I guess you're saying those are these intermediate players are less amenable to that approach.
In some cases, but you're right, the point of pressure is also if they're sensitive to pressure from their investors, particularly if they're majority shareholders or folks who really play a role from the investment side. And then the supply chain, they're also sensitive to pressure from the folks who are buying raw material from them, right? Those agreements. So, this is an example. S&G Biofuel may not be that susceptible to campaigning against their brand. Nobody knows about them. But if Unilever comes and they buy 20% of the product, right, they respond to that. So that's the creative ways to use these relationships.
Super. Okay, any questions or comments? Or if people on this call have experience bringing private sector, bringing leverage to the private sector as a way, moving back to the supply chain to respect rights, basically. Christina?
Hi, good morning. I really enjoyed that presentation. I have a question regarding governments, right? Governments, I imagine, are the ones that would grant these concessions to these large companies to access these lands. How then do you, I mean, it's one thing to try to bring the companies to the table to dialogue and to try to forge a new path, an alternative for them. But understanding that governments are also making money granting these concessions, how do you contend with the obvious backlash that will come, because governments will fight you for trying to get to the companies? How do communities handle that, particularly given that you are then up against two major giants, right? You're up against the government and you're trying to bring the companies to the table.
Absolutely. That's a great question, and very valid across all the regions. You know, I mentioned in the beginning that the private sector wields substantial political capital over government, right? What's the government? The government wants investment. You know, the money motivates. You know, at the same time, that's why it's important to explore this supply chain mapping to understand who among the private sector have committed to what and how sensitive they are, right? They too, depending on where they sit in the chain, have made global commitments to leverage their supply chains to avoid, you know, to reduce deforestation or zero deforestation or support human rights. So they have to comply with that. You know, in the global space, one of the key considerations for companies now is compliance with the EU legislation, and now, you know, it's been adopted in some European countries, requiring human rights due diligence and prohibiting deforestation associated with products imported into European markets. None of the companies can actually validate either of those things really truly validate those, you know, those items associated with their commodity production. And of course, there's the link with land rights. So the point I'm trying to make is from the private sector side, there are ways leveraging what they've committed to bring them on side, and leverage that as a partner to influence and push government. That's what I meant by leveraging the political capital of companies. Now that's going to take different forms depending on what the particular case is. I mean, Indonesia's you know, really complex because, you know, palm oil is a national priority, so the government's strongly involved. But there are ways.
Super. Thank you, David.
Yeah, I'd be curious, Bryson, to hear what your thoughts on how some of this might be incorporated into the 10-year facilities funding projects, the 10-year facility funds.
Great question, and I'm certain others would have some reflections on that. I mean, you know, the 10-year facilities business of supporting, you know, registration, mapping, you know, helping to secure rights over large areas. I'm thinking of the example of Kenya. You know, those projects likely overlap in some way or linked to where companies are sourcing or where they're active, depending on what sector they're in. so the potential to engage is there. I know many in the private sector are, particularly those who have developed forest positive policies that comply with 2030 climate and conservation, contribute to 2030 climate and conservation goals. They've now described a mandate to support securing community land rights. So I think those options to engage and link certainly exist. I need to know more about some specific projects, but as folks are supporting them, my contact information is here. If you'd like to be in touch, I'd be happy to advise or link you with folks who can help, or even link up with the Interlocking Group Network if those connections exist.
Super. Now we've only got about 6 minutes left, but I'd love to hear from both James and Raymond. James?
Hi, Bryson. You mentioned community-based monitoring being a key part of this work. And so just curious about what sort of infrastructure and tools need to be in place for the communities to achieve that monitoring.
Sure. I think the short answer to your question is the infrastructure for that doesn't exist. And that's at once the emerging challenge, but also really big opportunity, not only in the private sector space, but engaging with to support communities to engage in more balanced manner with other, powerful stakeholders, the conservation community, the climate finance community, as a vehicle to do that. The case that I described is, one of the outputs from it is going to be, describing those rules of the game and piloting the shape of a vehicle whereby, community data is fed, or communities are providing data in the manner that's most appropriate for them, and the companies are documenting and responding to it. Defining that infrastructure and architecture to do that is one of the priorities of the Interlocking Group. This year, we're developing a global guidance document to describe emerging practice for companies and investors to engage with and respond to locally sourced data on environmental and social impacts. The state of play right now is from the company side. If a company wants to understand if their policies or their supply chains are sustainable, they're not currently able to ask the people who have to live with the impacts, right? That connection really doesn't exist yet. And that's the bridge we're trying to build. And I think there's a big opportunity to do so.
Thank you. Raymond?
Yes, it's just a reflection, Dan. It's when I listen to Bryson's presentation, which is really fascinating, I try to link it with the India presentation yesterday on sustainability, where they use technology to make the value chain for forest product more visible, and to also try to track and record the stocks of those different forest products, and making the transaction between the communities and the private sector, the buyers, more visible and accountable. Is this kind of approach that Bryson, you can use from this interlocking group, where the private sector can even support this adoption of this mechanized technology to improve the value chain of some of these forest products for this indigenous community and help them widen their market access and also track the different stock?
Absolutely. I think, I only touched on, one use of, local, community-based monitoring, in this case, to influence supply chain practice. And what you're suggesting is a broader use. And I think also, very, very valid, there's demand from, consider Nestle has just released their strategy for supporting the cocoa sector in Cote d'Ivoire. And they're using just just precisely the technologies and the approach that you're suggesting to link all the way, to map all the way down to individual producers, maps, understand stock, requirements at local level in terms of inputs to make, to help folks be more productive and improve the prices that are paid in terms of for the raw material. So, I think there are a whole lot of uses, and certainly what you're suggesting is one of them. I think another is, I was talking about the using for communities to capture negative impacts of supply chains in terms of social and environmental impacts. There's also a big opportunity looking at the next 6-7 years to 2030 and building the case for communities as contributed to climate and conservation goals, to document the positive impacts of community control and governance of rural areas and forests. One, helps build the case for stronger rights to governments, helps companies make the case for engagement, and builds the case for our key constituency at large.
Bryson, I'm going to jump in because we've only got about a minute left, and there's some comments in the chat that are really interesting. And the first one is just an observation from Anne-Sophie. Tenure facility is also about addressing conflicts, and this requires engagement with the private sector. However, communities need to be empowered to engage in such a process. This is also something that tenure facility could support. Just a reflection, there's not time to reflect on these. I just want to make sure we share them. Dewey has a really important thing, which is there, he says, still wondering how company operation in such large scale with monoculture systems can still be in line with indigenous people's recognition. Is there some fundamental mismatch between large scale industrial monoculture and recognizing the rights of indigenous people? And then lastly, from Christina, who spoke at the very beginning, we have conflicts with third parties grabbing indigenous lands under the umbrella of conservation. For example, Flora Fauna International buying 13,500 acres of land on indigenous territory. Perhaps we could benefit from your experience to try to engage them, taking attention to the felt risks and identifying the potential alternative pathways, the two ones you mentioned. And then Anne-Sophie, again, at the very end, just pop this up. Tenure facility can support capacity building for communities to conduct effective monitoring of corporate practice and support them in using the data they have collected by strengthening